Hey guys, welcome to another edition of the Debrief podcast here on FingerLakes1.com and FL1 Radio. I'm Josh Durso, and Jackie Augustine is off this week, but in her place we have the incomparable Ted Baker from Finger Lakes Morning News and Finger Lakes Radio. Thanks so much for being here.
Well, I'm glad. I didn't know I had to fill Jackie's shoes. That's a pretty big task.
I didn't want to put that kind of pressure on you.
Yeah.
But yeah, we're going to be talking about some of the headlines that we've been reading. Obviously, election season in full swing. That means lots of campaign ads and everything like that. Is there anything in particular, before we start jumping into some of the individual stories that we've been seeing, is there anything in particular that really irks you or really bothers you about election season in particular?
Yeah, there is. I don't like the negative advertising. I guess I'm kind of old school, and I realize I'm not a typical voter because I'm in the news talk business, so I follow this stuff closely and longer than most people. But just the negative campaigning, I make a joke about it now. I posted on Facebook today, so I'm supposed to vote for the guy in color and not vote for the one in black and white slow motion. I mean, portraying the other candidate as being the most terrible thing in history. I want to know why I should vote for you. Tell me what your positions are and why I ought to vote for you. Don't tell me why I ought to vote against the other person.
So obviously, I was on your radio show this morning. We were talking a little bit about a Wallet Hub poll, and I wanted to sort of run some of the numbers by you and just get your reaction to them, because I know we had a couple minutes to talk about it, but not too long. So New York State basically ranks near the bottom across the board in voter turnout, engagement, however you want to frame it or call it. 48th in registered voters during the 2016 election, 49th in voter turnout in 2014, 44th in voter turnout in 2016, 38th in voter accessibility. But in voter contributions, which is one of the things we were talking about, they rank 5th. So New York State ranks 5th in how much money is being contributed to political campaigns, but very poorly in actual turnout. When you hear that, when you see those kinds of numbers, what sort of goes off in your brain? Like, how do we get to that point?
Well, I hadn't seen that Wallet Hub thing until you told me about it. So what I kind of wonder is how many of these numbers are sort of built into the infrastructure of the state. When you have a state that has New York City and Wall Street, you're going to have a lot of money. So it doesn't surprise me that contributions are high. And I was wondering, after we talked about this, in terms of the other numbers being low, I wonder how much it has to do with being a primarily single-party state. I mean, essentially, Democrats control New York on the statewide level. The population and the money is downstate in the New York City area. So I wonder, for example, how a state like Massachusetts, which is kind of similar, compares. I came to New York from Massachusetts. The power, the money, the Democrats are in the eastern part of the state. The western part there is more rural, more conservative. So I think some of those numbers may be sort of factors of what kind of state we are geographically and politically.
That's interesting, because you're absolutely right. California, Texas, and New York were 3 of the 4 worst for voter engagement across the board. So I sort of thought to myself along the same lines. Obviously, Texas is quite a bit different than New York State.
Yeah.
But they seem to have the same issue. And isn't it kind of funny, because we hear, especially us in the news, we hear how this is one party blames the other party for turnout numbers. One party says, well, it's their fault that no one's coming out to vote. It's their fault, or it's because of this law, or it's because this law doesn't exist. All these sort of it's finger pointing. Obviously, we're used to that during election season, especially. But I thought it was kind of funny. It's like, well, you have Texas, and you have New York, and you have California. They're all suffering from the same thing. They're 3 of the largest states. And like you said, the only thing I could really think of was that maybe it's tied to voters just feeling like their vote doesn't really matter because the state is so large and driven to one side?
Right. I mean, if you're a conservative in upstate New York, you don't have much voice. I mean, I have the Republican assemblyman and the Republican senator on, and I mean, the Senate, the Republicans are a majority, so they can get a little bit more done when it was Senator Nozzolio and now Pam Helming. But, I mean, Brian Cole, Bob Oakes come on my show once a month and talk about all the things they're trying to get done in Albany, but you just can't do it when the numbers are so overwhelmingly on the other side. So, people talk about should upstate break away and become its own state. That would never work economically.
Right.
We rely on that money from downstate. So I just think there's some infrastructure things that are kind of built in. But then you go back to that negative campaigning. I think a lot of the advertising, frankly, is made so that people won't come out and vote, because I think the people who really kind of pull the strings behind the scenes would just assume that most of us stay home so that they can continue to run things.
Right. So a little later, we're going to get into how we feel some of the races are going to turn out. But I did want to also ask you, because you mentioned something with Brian Kolb. I heard your interview last week with him. Really awesome, because I thought it was interesting, him giving sort of an alternative perspective on the Schoharie accident.
Yeah.
Basically saying, let's not rush into this. What was, after listening to him talk about it and some of the things that he was saying, what was your feeling toward that whole, obviously tragedy, but at the same time, the approach that he was taking to it?
Well, I was impressed because, frankly, I think it's no secret our senior senator in New York loves the camera, and the junior senator would like to be president, so she doesn't mind getting some publicity either. And I just think it's endemic to the way that we do news nowadays, is the rush to judgment and the rush to blame, and let's wait and find out what happened. I mean, Senator Schumer's talking about licensing and everything. We don't know if this driver, would having a commercial license have made him not run through the stop sign? I mean, who knows? We don't know what happened yet. So I thought that was a very measured approach on the part of Assemblyman Kolb, and just let's wait. We have the beast is the problem now. We have the 24-hour news media, call it the beast, that must be fed. So you can't sit back and wait. You have to have immediate reaction, immediate opinion, immediate conflict to draw viewers in.
Yeah. I did think it was interesting. I did see the headline, it was last night maybe. They said that because of the criminal investigation, the NTSB investigation is essentially on hold. Nothing's happening. So the people who are looking for answers on that front, because as soon as it happened, it seemed a lot of folks were happy and elated at the fact that the NTSB was investigating, because it felt like this very objective authority that was going to be evaluating this tragedy. And now it's like we may be waiting, how long will it take a criminal proceeding to play out on this front? You could be talking about years.
Well, and apparently the NTSB isn't being given access to the vehicle and some of the evidence. And we were talking about on the Finger Lakes Morning News this morning how much of this plays into the whole Cuomo versus the feds thing with the road signs and everything. And it's not uncommon in law enforcement, too, for there to be sort of squabbles between the local guys and the state guys and the federal guys. So it sounds to me like there's a little bit of kind of a turf war going on for who's going to have control of this investigation, which is too bad, because we just like to find out what happened.
Now, that's a dynamic that I hadn't given any thought. I'm glad you just I
don't know. I mean, that's just, I'm shooting from the hip here. But
right. It's interesting because we're going to be in this sort of like stalled out phase now, probably for months, maybe close to a year, I would assume, as the criminal part of it gets sorted out. And it's just a lot of people, I think, are going to be wondering. And then, a year from now, we were talking a couple weeks ago about the whole incident in Canandaigua, which has now turned civil, with the parole officer who was shot and killed in her apartment. Then this will then turn into a civil case after the criminal part of it is done. And it's just going to be a very, very slow grind to getting any kind of answer. But let's talk about some of the things in this election cycle that we've been seeing. Have you seen the John Walsh ad for Catco?
Yeah.
What was the America's Most Wanted creator, for those who don't know him, obviously he's like a TV legend. I remember watching him when I was 3, 4, 5 years old. America's Most Wanted. Everybody remembers it. And then he just appears in this campaign ad. And it's like, what? Wait, my question was like, what is the local tie? There is no local tie. What does he have to do with this race? Or why is his, other than the celebrity factor, which I think is, what you typically see with these athletes and various celebrities jumping into the political arena, to weigh in. Taylor Swift posted to Instagram, and that was a big deal a couple weeks ago. John Walsh, why is he getting involved with this race?
Well, the joke I made was that if the host of America's Most Wanted was going to get involved in a campaign, it should be Chris Collins. But, well, it's you always say to yourself, should these celebrities be allowed to have this big a voice? But then again, if I'm a celebrity and I know that my celebrity gives me a greater voice, I'd want to use it. I mean, if you have political opinions and you want to get them out there. So I don't blame celebrities for using that celebrity. I think mostly what it is that John Walsh is a fairly well-liked figure in that part of New York. And so if you can get somebody that people like on your side, that can't hurt you in a campaign.
And yeah, I mean, it goes back to what you said in the beginning of the show, the black and white versus the color. That is how we are sort of geared. And I think, maybe at some point, if there's any sort of campaign reform that would be really beneficial and just immediately create a tonal difference in our elections, maybe it's the TV ads that need to be overhauled. And I'm not saying, the ads that we hear on radio or the ads that we see online are any better. I understand the whole fake news dynamic and some of the really invasive Google ads that you see, on your browser from time to time. But it seems like, and of course, Jackie Augustine would be rolling over right now saying, hold on, you need to get the money, you need to fix the loophole, the LLC loophole, and I get that. But let's fix the ads at least so that what the average voter who isn't glued to every headline that's coming out during election season is a little less discouraged about what they're supposed to be turning out to vote for.
Well, I don't think there's a legal solution here because you run into First Amendment problems. You can't tell people what they can or can't put in their ad. I think what it's going to take is voters rejecting this kind of campaigning. Voters need to call up. I'm going to call somebody out by name because I've done it on the air. Mm-hmm. Congressman Katko's campaign. It's been mostly portraying his opponent as a carpetbagger, using the term visiting professor, which is an academic term that has no real meaning in terms of residency in a race. And Dana Balter's going to raise your taxes, playing that soundbite over and over. There'd be a tax increase. Well, that was a response to a specific question, and it's all pretty disingenuous. So until voters say to the congressman and to the others who use the same kind of tactics, I don't want this tactic, I'm not voting for you because of it, then we're still going to have it. I think the control of these things lies within the people more than it does the legal system.
So you started us down this road, so I'm gonna say let's jump into it. That race. Let's start with that race. Obviously, I think that commercial that you're referencing, the visiting professor ad, is pretty much the only one that I've been seeing, other than the John Walsh ad that just popped up in the last week.
That's been the primary one. There's another one that's come on recently. Apparently, Dana Balter owns some property in Florida and didn't pay her taxes on it.
The warrant one, yeah.
Which, I haven't looked into this, but my guess would be that there's about a 99% chance she messed up and missed a deadline and forgot. I mean, that happens with absentee property owners. So it's just, to me, Congressman Katko has a pretty good record as a bipartisan Republican who's tried to work with the other side. That district has kind of gone back and forth over the years, Republican-Democrat.
Absolutely.
So, why not tout that record rather than painting your opponent as something she really isn't?
Yeah, so the first thing I thought to myself when I started to see these ads, and obviously the money probably has a big part of it. I think she outraised him in the last cycle. But it's like, why are you going that way? What is the reason? What is the intent?
Because, I'll tell you the reason, because it works.
Right, but the flip side of it is somebody who supports him is going to say, this guy he's bipartisan. He runs down the middle for the most part. If anything, he receives a fair share of criticism from the right, who say he isn't far enough to the right. So why not just run on your merits and say to hell with the sort of back and forth of like you said, those very petty ads, and that's exactly what they feel like.
And I think the answer to that is the same as the answer to Watergate: follow the money. A lot of these ads are funded by the national committees, and that's where the political consultants and the experts get in, and they'll tell you this is how you win elections. So I think that candidates are being told, we'll give you your millions from the National Campaign Committee, but in order to get them, you've got to run the kind of campaign we want you to run. So I think that's why these campaigns are going this way. And again, because it's effective. We need voters to just say, enough, I'm going to stop this. And the other factor, I think, is there seems to be a feeling that it's okay to say anything during a campaign, and once the campaign is over, it's to be forgotten. We see that in primaries. Candidates beat the heck out of each other and then hold hands and endorse one another, when somebody wins. So I think we need to start to demand that people's speech counts for something, that if you say something in your campaign, it means something. Because I think there's that tendency to just say, well, that was the campaign and that's how we do things. And, look at all the Republicans that couldn't stand Donald Trump during the primary campaign when he was in that field of 17. And then all one by one, when they drop out, they all jump in and endorse him. So were you being dishonest then, or are you being dishonest now?
And do you think there's a factor of there just being too much of it for people to even, for the average person, the average consumer of news, to even be able to remember or recall all of these different sound bites? Because that's what they get broken down into a sound bite. You see them for a few days during the election cycle, and then maybe by election day, some of them you've forgotten about completely. This John Walsh ad is probably one of them. Most people are probably going to forget about it once the election comes and goes, but really it's a pretty unique thing to have happen. I can't recall the last time, even for a congressional race, where some well-known person from a nationally syndicated television show popped up in an ad.
Yeah, I'm wondering who's going to get Jim Boeheim.
And,
get somebody like that to stand behind you.
So what's your feeling on that race in terms of outcome? Is it, because obviously this is a seat that's flipped back and forth for the probably last 12 or 15 years. But I've sort of sat in the seat of, this is Katko's race to lose.
I agree with that.
Because it doesn't really seem like, and the money advantage, and Dana Balter could very easily win this race, but it just seems like it's on the incumbent to just sort of survive, and this shouldn't be any different for him, right?
I think that's right, and I've always believed that if you're a challenger, it's incumbent upon you to prove. What you're basically saying is we should fire the guy who's been doing this job and replace him with you. So, if somebody comes to my radio station and says, I want Ted's job, hopefully they're not going to give it to him. But if he can show that he's way more qualified than I am and is willing to work for half the price, then they have to think about it. So, but it also comes down to turnout. Republicans generally get their voters to turn out. Democratic voters, it's a little harder sometimes. So, nationally, these congressional races are being painted as referendums on the president. I don't necessarily think it's playing out that way here in the Finger Lakes. We don't see a whole lot of, some of the ads talk about, Tom Reed votes with Trump all the time or whatever, but I don't see it that way. So I really think it comes down to whether there is a big Democratic turnout push and whether there's a feel among Democrats that we can take back the House, maybe we can take back the Senate. In 2020, we can take back the presidency and reverse all the things that have happened under Donald Trump, which is what Democrats say they want to do.
Do you think, this is one of the things that we've been batting around here in the newsroom and also just among friends, will there be a blue wave? Is this mythical thing, is there a chance it could be real?
Well, I think there will be, to the extent that there almost always is in midterms. Generally, the party in power loses seats. I think that there's some buyer's remorse among some Republicans about putting Donald Trump in the White House. I think there was a feeling on the part of some moderate Republicans that all these things he was doing on the campaign trail he wouldn't do as president, and what we found is that the guy we saw on the campaign trail is the guy we get as president, pushing the norms. So if I had to guess, and this is what most of the experts seem to be saying, I think the Democrats will take back the House, probably not quite the Senate. If a couple of races flip, that would still be a possibility. So, call it what you want, and both sides are going to frame it to their best interests. So I think there'll be probably a fairly typical midterm swing where the party in power tends to lose seats.
And I guess that's the reason why I'm sort of hesitant to, jump into this blue wave concept, because I think this is just pretty stock election swing, like sort of the swing of the pendulum.
Yeah,
back
I
and
don't
forth.
think it's going to be so. Now, if the Democrats manage to take back the Senate, then that's a pretty good wave.
That's a wave.
That's more than what you would expect. But yeah, it's there's a lot of divisiveness in our country right now, obviously, and so the Democrats, this is part of their strategy. We get the House, we get the Senate. Then we start hearings on the president, and heaven help us then when it's going to get very partisan.
We'll have plenty to talk about.
Yeah.
So obviously the other big congressional race, Tracy Mitrano, the Democratic challenger, taking on Tom Reed, the Republican incumbent. What is your take on that race in terms of how you feel it'll turn out? I've looked at this one, and I'm not sure any Democrat could really overcome the numbers, the volume that would have to be made up in order to win an election. I think it would take a real wave, a real blue wave.
Yeah, I think the feeling is, I think most people, I tend to lean to the left. I like Tom Reed. I love the Tom for Congress signs. I want one of those when the campaign's over. I was going to go grab one, but I figured there's a tracker on the back of it, and I might get into trouble, so I'll wait until after the campaign. I think he's as moderate a Republican as there is. I mean, you talked about how the Republicans tend to hold their candidates pretty strictly. If you vote 90% of the time, that's not enough. I just don't see any real buzz for Mitrano or anything that tells me that the incumbent's going to lose here. So, and typically, I mean, that seat's been a little more reliably Republican. It's tended to be moderately Republican over the years. I mean, it's not real hard right Tea Party type guys get that seat, but I just don't see anything telling me that there's going to be a change there.
Yeah, and doesn't that contribute to the whole idea of, a New York State Republican is not your typical Republican that we're used to seeing in the national headlines, where you are talking about those Tea Party guys and those really far right personalities that are in Congress. I don't even want to call them lawmakers, because they're personalities more than anything else. But let's switch gears. Chris Collins is one of the most fascinating scenarios I think I've ever seen play out. He was out after the charges, the financial charges that were brought against him. Then he jumped back in. Now he's in and he's actively campaigning, and the polling seems to suggest that he's still got a little bit of an edge. What do you make of that? And two, is there any hope for good, clean government if this guy wins?
No, there isn't. Well, at the risk of seeming really partisan, a lot of Republicans would rather vote for a criminal than a Democrat. I mean, and in a way, that's to their credit. I mean, the Republicans are very good at enforcing party discipline. You talked about it. If a guy votes 90% of the time with the Republicans, a lot of Republicans say that's not enough, and they'll run a primary challenger. So there's very good party discipline. If you're a Republican, you back the Republicans. If you're a Republican voter, you vote for the Republican. I mean, it seems to me, if there was ever an open and shut case, this is it. I mean, the record is there. The news was about to come out about this stock, and immediately several phone calls to family members and close associates who owned the stock, followed by them dumping the stock. I mean, I don't see any way that you spin that into there was no offense here. I mean, it seems pretty cut and dried.
Yeah, and I do find it. I did hear the theory. I listened to some AM talk radio from the far right in the afternoon sometimes. I did catch a little bit of some theories regarding, well, if Collins wins the seat, he hasn't been convicted of anything, so hold your horses there. But then also the argument that, well, it'll take the party out of the equation. Voters will have, because then he would resign, and then there would be a special election, and voters would be able to be the ones who make the choice, and not the I believe it's 12 or so party folks, committee chairs for the counties, who would ultimately make the decision if it played out the way I think some people wanted it to over the summer and the beginning of fall. I just think about the PR damage And it's terrible to think of it that way, but the public relation, the communications damage that this does to that seat and politics as a whole, where you have another elected official essentially going down the corruption lane, and here we are. They're just going to get to keep their seat, unless a political election miracle happens.
Well, and it's the same thing on the other side with Andrew Cuomo. I mean, the Republicans have tried to use the corruption angle on him, and I talk about this with Assemblyman Kolb a lot, that I don't think it sticks. I don't think anybody cares. They just see it as business as usual. I don't know what the answer is. I mean, I'm not a backer of term limits because I believe that we have term limits, and they're called elections. Voters can take out the incumbent anytime they want, so I'm not in favor of artificially limiting terms. Maybe we need legislators to begin pledging to serve for one term. I mean, it's not so much on the federal level, but on the state level. For example, the state I come from, New Hampshire, has a legislature where the legislators are paid almost nothing. It's a part-time job. It's not something you do full-time, and it's more of a true citizen legislature. I think we've gotten away from, regular people can't really become members of the legislature. You haven't got the time or the money to do it.
So obviously another one of the big races, state race. Can Mark Molinaro take out Governor Cuomo? Can it happen?
No.
You don't think so?
No, there's just the numbers just aren't there. There's too many Democratic voters. Downstate will go largely for Cuomo. Upstate will go for Molinaro. I don't see it. I think that, and I don't know if you're a Republican in New York, I don't know how you turn that around. It's just such an advantage in numbers and money and power in the state. I think that how close the race is will be interesting to watch, because, I mean, if it is fairly close, then maybe some of the corruption stuff is starting to stick, and maybe there is starting to be some dissatisfaction with Governor Cuomo.
Yeah, and I think that's real, but I think at this point, if he gets through this election, it just doesn't matter, because then all eyes are on 2020, and I think it's pretty clear at this point, judging by the rhetoric that's been coming out of his camp and obviously Albany as a whole, his focus is on the presidential elect in the next presidential cycle, or so it seems. Another one of the regional races, Keith Batman, challenging Assemblyman Finch. What is your take on that race in terms of how seriously you think Batman's challenge will be?
I'm not a real big expert on that eastern part of the Finger Lakes, but it just seems to me like Gary Finch is a guy that he's been around there for a long time. Everybody likes him. Doesn't seem to be, again, not one of those hardcore, bomb-throwing type of Tea Partiers. So I thought that was interesting that he would mount that challenge. It seems to me like a very difficult incumbent to try to dislodge.
Yeah, and I do think it's interesting because he is a Democrat in a primarily with his legislature seat in Cuyahoga County. He is a Democrat elected in a primarily Republican territory, so it seems logical that that's the candidate that those folks would want to put forward. It seems like he's had a pretty sensible campaign. He sounds more like a moderate, middle of the road person or a candidate rather than a far left or a far right candidate, which I think is important. Maybe that's one of the more balanced races in the whole region, as far as, the candidates are pretty close together on the spectrum. So it'll be interesting to see how voters go on that one.
Well, you made a good point, too. I'm not sure how much of that challenge was that he wanted to run for that seat and how much of it was the Democrats wanted to run a decent challenger. I mean, when you lose a seat time after time after time, you eventually say, okay, who can we get that can really put a challenge on?
And obviously the one big race in Ontario County that's contested for sheriff. What has it been like watching that one? Because you just travel a little bit outside of Ontario County, and it is almost as if there isn't even a race happening. Both candidates seem to be pretty quiet. I drive through Ontario County and I see signs, but other than that, I don't see a lot of effort. And effort might not be the right word. I don't see any of those bombs being thrown. I don't see really anything being thrown.
So I guess this is a good test case then for whether the things that we talked about can work in politics. I interviewed all three candidates. Point of disclosure, known Bob Green for a long time, was defeated in the primary, worked with him at the radio station. I've always thought that we're blessed. The sheriff's departments that we have in the Finger Lakes are extremely well run. I think the sheriffs that we have are tremendously good at what they do. And I thought all of the candidates for Ontario County Sheriff just presented themselves very well. They had detailed plans on what they wanted to do. And I think to a certain degree, a race like sheriff doesn't lend itself to that kind of name-calling politics. I mean,
Right.
Do you really want the sheriff to be somebody that, just called his opponent an idiot last week? So I'm not as surprised to see the candidates really just touting their backgrounds and their plans, and let's see how that works, because that could be a model. That's what we say we want in all of our races. So it's kind of interesting. On the one hand, we say that we want that, but then you and I, who are in the business, kind of say, that race is kind of dull. There's not a lot going on, and no great sound bites. And so there's that sort of contradiction between what the ideal we all say that we want, and then how we actually behave when we get it.
Yeah, and I mean, I'd be the first to admit, I also interviewed all three of the candidates before the primary happened, and obviously Henderson didn't have a primary, but there wasn't any, and obviously maybe your interview experience was a little bit different, but none of the candidates were really throwing. I mean, they were just pretty much sticking to the script. They were sticking to what they brought to the table and really nothing else. But that does, the last sort of question topic that I wanted to touch on today was debates. Obviously, we haven't seen many this particular cycle. What is your take on debates? Should they be forced? Should they be sort of organized by a third party that doesn't have any swing one way or another? Or how should they be? Because it seems every year around this time we hear quite a few people say, I wish there were more debates. Obviously, Reed and Metrano couldn't agree on terms to any debates north of the southern tier. So, we're getting some forums, individual encounters, but does there need to be more in terms of the debate side of it?
Well, I'd like to see it. And again, if we're going to really do away with these bad politics we're talking about, then we need more of the good kind like this. Now, having said that, debates as they're currently done I don't think are very useful. You have 2 minutes, you have 1 minute, and the beeper goes off and they keep talking anyway. I mean, if you ever try to moderate one of those things, good luck with that. I think if there were more substantive, I don't even know if debate's the right word, maybe forums. I mean, the old-fashioned, the Lincoln Douglas, where people traveled from 2 hours out in the countryside and listened to these people speak for 2 hours and got a real sense of what they believe in. I think the way debates are done now is geared toward the media and their desire for sound bites. Everybody wants the 10-second gotcha sound bite. I'm not sure that helps us know more about a candidate.
Excuse me. Yeah, I have to agree. I would like to see some sort of the same way people talk about campaign finance and say, well, gee, I would love to see, each candidate have the same amount of money to work with when they're running a campaign. Well, it's idealistic in that same sort of way where I'd like to see some sort of body be the holder and organizer of all political debates, whether you see little grassroots organizations do that or you see...
Yeah, I mean, League of Women Voters does a good job with that.
But the problem with those is that, or so it seems, is they tend to have the perception of skewing one way or another, and you have candidates who refuse to take part. And it's like it's perpetuating this whole thing where, he aligns with so-and-so, so I'm not going to participate. And it becomes this really vicious cycle. I'm not really sure how we dig ourselves. I have no idea how we dig ourselves out of the hole that we've created, politically speaking.
Well, and here I go chucking bombs at the Republicans again, but our president has fostered a distrust of news media and this idea that we're all slanted. Do we have opinions? We do. whether it's you and what you do on FingerLakes1.com, whether it's me and what I do on the radio. I mean, we try to be fair to people. One of the things I'm proudest of is that as somebody who leans to the left, I have all these Republican guests who come on and they feel like they're fairly treated.
Yeah.
So I think you have to, if you're a candidate, trust that you're not being asked this question for a gotcha. You're being asked this question to get the answer. I mean, we all have our opinions, and nobody can be 100% free of bias, but I think most of us try to be professionals in the news media, and we try to get at the truth. That's what we're here for.
Yeah, and it's hard in the current climate, I think, to push back. That's going to be a really hard corner to turn, it seems like, at this point. But before we go, where can folks hear you every single day of the week, Monday through Friday?
I'm on the Finger Lakes Morning News on Finger Lakes News Radio. We have WGVA in Geneva, which is 95.9 and 1240, that covers the western half of the Finger Lakes. And then my colleague Steve Penstone covers the eastern half on 98.1 and 1590 WAUB. So if you're not familiar with how the show works, when we do the local news, we kind of split the region in half so that the eastern people get news of importance to them, and the western people get news of importance to them, and then we come on afterwards and talk about Lord knows what.
All right. Well, and I'm sure you'll be coming back here again soon to talk about all the different things. Elections after the fact, after the dust is settled, we'll come back and try to figure things out and see where we stand. But that is going to do it for us today. I'd like to thank everyone for watching, and we will be back next week with another edition of The Debrief. Until then, don't forget to download the FingerLakes1.com app for the latest news, weather, sports, and podcasts like this one.